Let's come up to the front here. All right, so very nice job as I've been walking around. Looks like everyone is on the right track here. Here we have a sample. These questions are very long. So basically we're looking at the time spent on the internet, right? So what I did before we do the question is I always recommend just writing down all the information because it's always good to just have it there for you to use. I forgot who wrote up this. Was it Ange? All right. I'm not going to have you explain how to do this because Ange did a really good job. Just wrote down all our information. Very nice job doing that. All right. After that, I got Alyssa to write up her assumptions. I guess I don't really need to make you explain this as well because, well, S is definitely given to us. And the sample size was definitely bigger than 30. So nice job as well. All right. Part B was actually finding the critical value, and that was Mateus, right? Do you want to take us through how you did this one? Oh, yeah, you're right. Perfect. I do want to go a little bit more into how Mateus got it. Very nice job. When you're using the big chart, remember the row goes with the number of degrees of freedom. Can someone tell me how many degrees of freedom we had? 122, right? Because it's just n minus 1. So that's the row you use. But if you look at your chart, there isn't a row 122, right? So what row did I actually use? Ooh, it's actually 100. So you actually round down with these. I know I think, let's go back in the notes here. This is where it says, so always just use the next smaller number, not the next bigger number. I know it's kind of confusing since like all of these tiny steps either tell you to round up, round down. For these questions, you round down. Okay, and then you basically use the column corresponding to 98%. I know it doesn't say it on the first page, but it does say it on the back of the second page. And that's the column that you use. You should have gotten 2.364. Okay, any questions on the first page? All right, flipping on over to the back page, we want to find the standard error and the margin of error. Who wrote up this one? Was that Claudia? Yeah. All right, you want to take us through this one?
Well, for the standard error, I just did the sample standard deviation of the square root of that. And then for the margin of error, I multiplied that by the
Perfect. Nice. So we should have gotten 2.097 for the margin of error. Nice job there. Next up was finding the confidence interval. Gosh, who wrote up this one? Was that Hayden? Do you want to take us through this one?
Just added margin of error and subtracted
it. From the sample mean, we got these two numbers. You can write it out like this. This is totally great. Any questions so far? All right. And finally was interpreting the interval. I forgot who wrote up this one. Whoever wrote it did a good job, right? You basically just follow the template. We are 98% confident this time that the mean falls between these two numbers. The only thing I might change about the interpretation is whenever we talk about the mean, remember there's a population mean and a sample mean. This is really talking about the population mean. So I wouldn't necessarily mark it wrong, but if you're doing like a multiple choice question, the interpretation does talk about the population mean. All right. Any questions on doing these sorts of problems? All right, I think we're all on the right track here. I think we're good at finding these guys. I do want to talk about one more thing though. So I'm going to pass out a sheet of paper here. Okay, one more thing to talk about. You're welcome. All right. One last thing to talk about with confidence intervals. Okay, now the one thing about confidence intervals that I haven't really stressed yet is, well, on the test, I'm going to give you a confidence interval question, but I'm not going to tell you in the question to use the big chart or to use the small chart. You're going to have to figure that out on your own. So I guess a big question is, okay, given a question, do I use the big chart? Do I use the small chart? And how do I tell how to do that, right? Now, the only difference between the two questions that you see, big chart versus small chart, the only difference lies in the standard deviation, okay? For the questions that we've been working on so far, we've like today, we worked on a question involving the sample standard deviation. When we're given the sample standard deviation, you use the big chart, okay? Now, on the other hand, questions on Monday only gave us the population standard deviation. When you're given the population standard deviation, you use the small chart, okay? So essentially, when you're given a question, before you even do it, you kind of have to figure out, am I given the sample or the population standard deviation? Because that tells you which chart to use. And if you ever get confused, the top of this paper says, if you're given the population standard deviation or sigma, use the small chart. If you're given the sample standard deviation, use the big chart. So you might be wondering, okay, why do I have 5 practice problems with this? It seems very self-explanatory, but sometimes questions can be worded in a tricky way to make it kind of confusing which one you're actually using. So what I want to do is go through a few examples on how a question can be asked, and hopefully by the end we'll be experts on figuring out which chart to use. Okay. Now, for these questions, we're not actually going to solve the question. Like, we're not actually going to go through and come up with the interval and the interpretation. I just want to figure out which chart to use. Okay. Let's do number 1. Here we have a study of body temperatures. Bunch of temperatures were taken. Let's suppose that we only have the first 10 temperatures to work with. Okay. Well, that means if we only have the first 10, I guess that's a sample, right? That's a sample of 10 things. Cool. It says the mean and standard deviation of these 10 scores were 98.44 and 0.30 respectively. Okay. Well, the question just gave me the standard deviation. It's 0.30. I don't have to read the rest of the question if I'm trying to figure out what's going on, because the only thing that tells us which chart to use is the standard deviation. So now all I have to figure out is if this is a population or a sample standard deviation. Okay. Now, let's see. I want to figure out which one this is. Who thinks this is a population standard deviation? Who thinks this is sample standard deviation? Lots of hands. Okay. This actually is sample standard deviation. Anyone want to explain why? No.
It says during a study, a bunch of temperatures were taken, which would be another way to say a sample.
Yeah, perfectly, right? Perfect. It says the mean and standard deviation of the 10 scores. No, it says, okay, the 10 scores is the sample. So even though it's not explicitly saying the mean and standard deviation of the sample are these 2 numbers, the 10 scores is the sample. So even though it doesn't say sample, the 10 scores really mean sample. So this is definitely the sample standard deviation. So which chart am I using? The big chart or the small chart? Big chart, right? Sample standard deviation uses the big chart. Okay. I know this seems really stupid for me to go through these questions and figure out which ones to use, but honestly, it does get kind of tricky if you just kind of skim a paragraph and not practice before. So why don't we go through the next 4? I'll give you a few minutes to work through these. Just figure out, are we using the big chart? Are we using the small chart? And then we'll come back in a little bit. Bit more slowly. Okay, number 2, we have 36 St. Bernard dog weights yielding a sample mean of 193. It's known that the standard deviation of all St. Bernards is 18 pounds. So we can kind of just stop reading now because it says the standard deviation. We don't really care about anything else. Okay. Let's see. We want to figure out if this is population or sample. Who says this is the population standard deviation? Right. Who says this is the sample standard deviation? Oh, we're actually kind of split here. Anyone who said population want to explain? Annalise? Yeah, it says all. Any other ideas on why this might be population? Okay, for those of you who said sample, I kind of want to hear what you have to say. Any reasons for sample? It does say, wait, does it say sample standard deviation?
No, just a sample.
Oh, it does say sample in there. Yeah, that's true. Okay. I'm actually going to tell you the answer to this one is population. I know, kind of strange, right? So these questions can be really tricky, and I know it's kind of strange. Let me, basically for questions in this class, I can tell you some hints to look out for whenever you're looking at a question and trying to figure out if it's sample versus population. Let me tell you the biggest hint in this question, okay? The textbook, whenever it comes up with a question, usually whenever the textbook wants to talk about the population, if it wants to be a little bit more confusing, it'll use a phrase like this: it's known, okay? Usually it'll say it's known, it's previously known, or from previous studies. If ever there's something about that, known previously known, that's kind of the textbook's way of telling you that we're now talking about the population, okay? So whenever we have this, it's known, just know that, well, now we're talking about the population, okay? Another hint was when it said all Saint Bernard dogs, okay? Now I know it's very confusing to tell if it's talking about all 36 of the people in the sample or all Saint Bernards in all. Usually if they stick the word all in there, we're usually talking about the population, okay? The third hint that I can think of that this is talking about the population and not of the sample is, well, we first talked about the sample mean of the sample. Then we kind of ended the sentence and we started a brand new sentence talking about the talking about the standard deviation. So whenever it kind of breaks off talking about the sample mean, and then it starts a brand new sentence and now we're talking about the standard deviation, that's kind of your hint that, okay, now we're talking about the population and not the sample. So for those reasons, I'm going to say this is definitely talking about the population standard deviation and not the sample standard deviation. The biggest hint to me is it says it's known. Okay, so whenever it says that, we're talking about the population. Okay, so if it's the population standard deviation, which chart are we using? Small chart, good. All right, let's do number 3. Okay, says suppose scores on exams and statistics are normally distributed with an unknown population mean and a standard deviation of 3 points. Don't have to read any further because it gave us the standard deviation. Okay, who says this is the sample standard deviation? Who says this is the population standard deviation? All right, couple answer that. Anyone want to explain why? I will tell you, you're right. This is the population standard deviation. Okay, let me kind of explain why we're talking about the population here. Okay, so some more hints that we're talking about the population first. In the sentence, it starts the sentence talking about the population mean, and then it doesn't break off to a new sentence and talk about the standard deviation. In the same sentence, we're still talking about, well, this population, right? We didn't break off. So that's a hint that we're still talking about the population. I think the biggest hint in this question that we're not talking about the sample is, let's think about where the sample is introduced, okay? After we're introduced to the standard deviation, we start a brand new sentence, and this is where we talk about the sample, right? The sample isn't introduced before we started talking about the standard deviation. After we started talking about the standard deviation, now we're starting to introduce what the sample is. So it wouldn't make sense to talk about the population, it wouldn't make sense to talk about the sample standard deviation if we didn't even know what the sample was in the first place, right? So if the sample is talked about after the standard deviation is given, that's a big hint that we're talking about the population standard deviation. Okay. So which chart are we using? Big or small? Small chart, good. All right, let's move on to example number 4. Here we have the amount of time it takes to get your bachelor's degree. The National Center of Education Statistics surveyed a bunch of people. The mean was 5.15 and the standard deviation was 1.68. Who says sample standard deviation? All right, who says population? Okay, so more hands for sample. Who wants to explain why it's the sample standard deviation?
Because they introduced it later, so that's a makes sense.
Yeah, like it's definitely introduced after we talked about the sample. So that's a big hint that, okay, definitely talking about the sample here, right? So yeah, this is literally talking about the sample. Now, where's the sample here? Whenever the word surveyed is put in a sentence, that just means that we took a sample of the 4,400 graduates, right? So it introduced the sample of the 4,000 people. After it introduced the sample, it gave us the mean and the standard deviation of the sample, okay? One other hint that this is talking about the sample and not the population is, even though it didn't tell us that the mean is the gosh, sample mean and not the population mean, these questions aren't going to give us the population mean, right? We're asked what the population mean is. So if it gives us a mean, that has to be a sample mean, right? That has to be the sample mean. So if the standard deviation is in the same sentence as the sample mean, there's a good chance that we're still talking about the sample. This is definitely the sample standard deviation. Okay. So which chart am I using, big or small? Big chart, good. All right, let's just do one more. I wanted to know the average amount of steps people took per day. I took a sample of 14 people. The sample mean was 3,520 with a standard deviation of 300. Can kind of stop reading now, okay? Who says population standard deviation? Who says sample standard deviation? Good, okay, anyone want to explain why this is a sample standard deviation? Ange? Yeah, right. It's not like it started a new sentence and started talking about this standard deviation. It literally was talking about the sample mean, didn't really cut off. I know there's a comma there, but right after it talked about the sample mean, it just says with a standard deviation. So we're still talking about the sample here. We're not like breaking off from talking about the sample. Well, this has to be the sample standard deviation here. Okay. So if we're given the sample standard deviation, which chart are we using? The big chart, awesome. All right, so I think we're pretty good on figuring out what sort of chart to use. I'm gonna be honest, these sort of questions are a little bit more tricky than what I would normally give on a quiz or test. I can't really tell you about the final exam, but what I would do is if you take the final exam, just be very mindful of how the question is written. I know it might not explicitly give you which standard deviation you're given, but if you just take a look into the context clues, know what to look out for, like if it says it's known, or if you break off into a new sentence, I think it'll be pretty obvious which one that you're given. Okay. Guess it's about quiz time, right? All right. Before I give out the quiz, let's do a little review here, okay? On the quiz, we're using the small chart, right? So instead of the sample standard deviation, I think we're given the population standard deviation, right? Okay. Now on the quiz, if we're given an assumption question, we're not going to be asked about S anymore, right? We're going to be asked about sigma because, well, you can't do the question if you don't have sigma. Okay. Do the degrees of freedom matter with these questions? No, right? The quiz, degrees of freedom doesn't matter because we're not using the big chart. Okay. Do we still use the chart for critical values? Yes, we use the small chart. Cool. Standard error, is the formula the same? It's kind of the same. What's different though? It's sigma instead of S, right? So that changes there. Okay. Is the margin of error formula the same? Good, yes. Is the interval the same? Yes. Is the interpretation the same? Yes, right. I thought you said no. Yes, the interpretation. So everything's the same except for this formula and the assumptions. Okay, and well, the chart for the critical value. Okay. Who wants me to leave this on the board? Yeah, more people should raise their hand. Yes, people want me to leave this on the board. Okay. All right. Ready for your quiz? All righty.